which I finished 6 years ago, and paying huge amounts every month. Because essentially that's what they want. It actually, as long as the debt culture is not the state's debt, you force people to pay it back. When it becomes state's debt, you cut everything else so that you can actually pay back the bankers. In some ways, it's a terrifying thing, because one of the side effects of having a US education is that essentially universities become attachments to the defense industry, to the national security apparatus, and as it is here already, to the enterprises, to the corporations. In order to survive, you have to sell yourself to one of those different bodies, which a lot of us have ethical problems with. I think part of the reason also that sciences are being ring-fenced for that reason is because they are much more easily incorporated into that system already in some ways, and so they have to be ring-fenced because they're already good. They can provide service almost immediately to enterprise and national security apparatuses.
Actually, as right-wing and reactionary presses, they're having a hard time painting this protest as what they want to call it. Obviously they want to describe the student activists as vandals and so on, and they're having to really, really force this because it's blatantly clear from the image of the students that they're not being led astray by anarchists and deranged student leaders, but they're actually protesting for themselves and for the future of other students. In a way that makes it very hard to paint them all as some kind of crazed, deranged, violent fanatics. And this is very important because I think one of the things that, right-thinking people who work for media sometimes need to do is to appeal to the middle classes, to appeal to a kind of a temporal thing which touches on the kind of the thing you were just saying about loans and debt, because the fear of the structure of debt is a thing we need to be telling people about. I'm going to try, next piece I want to write for Communist Free is about the way in which debt structures people's subjectivity, the way it structures their life chances, and their kind of, the way they, can do anything in their life, basically. We know that when New Labour had this fantasy of getting 50% of people into university, part of this was because it was about creating an indebted generation who would take any job at the end, basically. If you've got this debt hanging over you, whether it's student debt, mortgage, combination of the two, loans, credit cards, you're in a position of weakness. You can't very well move away, you can't leave the country very easily. Unless you declare yourself bankrupt. I have many friends who've done that. But you know what I mean? You create a certain kind of docile subject, a particular kind of subject. And I think we need to be preemptively pointing out the way in which debt structures that form of subjectivity. That's one thing. One of the things that happened, I was in the kettle the other day for hours. It was freezing cold, and it was, deeply, deeply punishing, as it was supposed to be. They were tiring everyone out and making sure they didn't go off and run rampage around anywhere else. But one of the things that was incredibly striking, and I'm now in my early 30s, was just how young everyone was. And I felt slightly embarrassed, but that's fine. But how young they were and how sort of energetic they were and how not cold they seemed, for which I was very envious. But we need to link up the student protest with other protests. We need to link it up with the kind of cuts to the public sector in general. So move from the specific to the general. And obviously fight for campaigns. At Roehampton, for example, they're already cutting programs. They've closed down music, history of art. They're closing human rights. My own subject, philosophy, has always been under threat. Ever since I've been there, it's been under threat. It'll probably be closed in. They'll start talking about. I used to describe it. I said that the anger is justified, and I absolutely stand by what I wrote. But I think it's very important on the one hand to differentiate between violence against property and violence against people, and maybe even have a further discussion about whether we use the word violence at all, right? But as opposed to direct action or something else like this. So I think, I think it was time-wise a good thing to have done, but I felt.
Spoken like a true academic, wanting those inverted
Yeah,
commas.
you can't write the perfect piece, whatever. But yeah, somebody needed to write something like that was, telling the truth about what was happening, I suppose. Trying to.
Police and member of the new Anti-Capitalist Party. Well, first thing, what you do is very important to us in France because for many years we face a lot of attacks against public services, social laws, social benefits, etc. And every time the government say and the media say, okay, we are obliged to do those so-called reforms, those counter reforms. In fact, we are obliged because in the other countries, in other European countries, government do the same. And when we try to fight those attacks, they always told us, okay, you're the French and the French students, the French workers, you're always on strike, you make strike for nothing, and all the Europe laugh at us, etc. So it's very important to us to see that in other countries there are also struggles against the attacks of movement. But we, and even this year, we lose the movement about the reform of the pensions. But we are not, for the moment, we are not demoralized, we are not defeated, because we manage to learn lessons every time, and I think that's the most important thing in every movement. Maybe we have this general strike one day, but what I'd like to say to you, especially that the European capitalists are very well organized to elaborate policies of austerity, to break public utilities, the education, the labor law, and so our task is now to be as well.
A lot of cocktails, and my mother would call me, "Are you doing this?" But I couldn't even see. You couldn't even see. You were at the demonstration, so they would always show this kind of things. And from where I can see, there will always be people. I mean, if there's a ban, and you know, you have a system, a democratic system, where all of these views are not heard there. There will be some people who they will go in there because they have no other means for people to hear their point of view. So I think there will always be some kind of violence in a way. For instance, this is violence from a different point of view, right? I mean, in Greece we were having discussions and they were saying, don't occupy the universities. This is a violent thing, it's against the laws, you know? So violence takes lots of different ways and means and things like that. And I just want to say that from this point of view, and as the system is in this way, it's, you know, well, I mean, if you had an opinion poll, I would think that at least 2% would be against the cuts. And if people get 2%, they don't get elected. So it makes sense in a way to do all these kind of things. I don't think we will ever be able to convince everyone. I don't think we will ever be able to do this, and we should keep this in mind. And sometimes there will be people doing other stuff, more peaceful. You know, some people will agree, you know, that the cuts are bad, but we're against occupying because it's violent. So I think we should keep all these things in mind, and also have in mind that the media is always going to attack us because that's their job.
Revolution on the side of the Whitehall. Okay, they're obviously always looking for a particular image that sums up that protest. Okay, and it's very interesting. If you look at the cover of the Daily Mail yesterday, one of the things they're trying to do is go for this female protester image. It's like they're updating their kind of Ladette critique, which they pursued all the way from the 90s. You know, like the drunken, aggressive working class woman has now been replaced by the, you know, the angry, violent, very unladylike female protester, right? So that's what they went for yesterday, Rise of the Female Protester, because they're desperately trying to paint this as like, you know, they're trying to get a hold on this, and they don't really have one, right? So they're trying to kind of, you know, yes, of course, violence is always going to be spectacular. You know, it's very clear that the van, you know, increasingly clear that the van thing was A, the premise for the kettling in the first place, even though they kettled it before anyone did anything to the something van, and B, that the van was left there so that people would kick shit, you know, kick it, and, you know, like somebody sprayed on the back, you know, thanks for the police setup, you know, it's very, so, yeah, I think that the thing is we have to exploit, given that that's the structure of the spectacle, right, if you want to put it that way, I mean, you know, they're going to be looking for image, they're going to be looking for an angle. We have, yeah, our flank is right. I think, you know, they can't find student leaders. They, you know, obviously there's been a lot of shit thrown at Claire Solomon for her role, her position, by various people because she's identifiable. But at the same time, they're not doing a very good job at finding student leaders, nor isolating, you know, rogue elements or all this, you know, because there's so much footage out there. I mean, one of the things that's happened, you know, in the age of YouTube and social media and so on, like today, I mean, releasing the footage of the police horses storming the crowd. You know, the police denied that they used horses to storm the crowd. There's footage of it, right? You know, the same thing happened in Tomlinson. They put out some bullshit story, right? People have footage that disproves it immediately. I mean, this is where this kind of social networking, social media thing comes in again. You know, and then that sort of feeds back into the mainstream media, who can't then just repeat the sort of the police press releases. You know, and I think, I mean, there are some serious questions to be asked about how the students present themselves, let's say. You know, I mean, there's lots of debate at the UCL occupation about whether they allow alcohol in. I don't know what your policy is, but, you know, whether there's any, you know, whether, because if there is footage of, you know, students getting drunk and fucking or whatever, you know, that this is bad, right? You know, that the media can paint it as some sort of hedonistic, you know, sort of return to 68 bullshit, right? So I think, I mean, there are...
There is something like big undifferentiated mass that arise. You can't really do very much about it. It's just this sort of solid blur of stuff. And actually there's something very particular about media, which it has a very specific relationship, particularly the dominant press, to dominant forms of power and very powerful institutions in British society. And you can see it. Andy Coulson, whilst editor of the News of the World, oversaw a regime of basically phone hacking on an industrial scale. The police are talking about 6,000 individuals who had their phones hacked whilst he was editor, which he knew about. Andy Coulson is still the Prime Minister's press secretary, right? Despite this massive breach of the law and abuse of trust, totally immoral behaviour, that's a very, very close relationship with the government that News International maintains. So it's a very, very specific thing that exists there that I think we have to understand why you get certain representations in the press. The difficulty with this movement is that the initial device that I think the government certainly gave a heavy steer on, and the media then followed up with alacrity, that this was, as of the 10th of November, a tiny minority of troublemakers spoiling a nice day out for everyone else, was the narrative they wanted. Did not actually last very long, because frankly, the Daily Mail printed a picture of the several thousand who are outside Millbank Tower, and you know, you can try and spot the tiny minority, you know, within that crowd. Didn't last very long. And they're having even more problems after what happened yesterday, partly because I think the crisis of leadership inside the student movement now, which is that the official leadership, who ought to be the NUS, has just disappeared. I haven't seen Hayne White nor hair of our reporter for about 2 weeks now. It just seems to have gone to ground somewhere. No quotes from the NUS. NUS say nothing about the day. NUS didn't organise the day, and yet on the BBC's own estimate, it was about 3 times larger than the official demonstration 2 weeks previously. So at that point, when we don't have a leadership, we can't create a narrative, suddenly all sorts of possibilities open up in the press. And I think that's what we're starting to see.
That we make it clear what our limits are. And I think it's not embarrassing, it's not being, you know, anything less than right on to say we abhor and deplore those kind of tactics. As Martin Luther King drew attention to the power, as many have before and after him, of non-violent interaction, it is in the discipline that you show the power of the soul, actually, to say that we are strong inside and we are determined to see this through externally. So do not underestimate the power of non-violent interaction, not necessarily for drinking, as I see you're not doing, or having sex, or whatever it is, but we're having a public debate. We're interrogating ideas as students, as future people in public, right? We're showing the wider population what universities are about.
Presented in the media as kind of, you know, part of a kind of grand movement, along with the protests and so on. And so I wouldn't kind of beat yourselves up about anything, really. I think the bigger question about the logic of cuts, the rhetoric of cuts, there are lots of people writing about, you know, how this kind of austerity story we're being sold is bullshit. You know, this is an ideological kind of attack. You know, the British deficit isn't that big. We've had bigger deficits and we haven't had resorted to these austerity measures. I do agree that there's a kind of big media propaganda that needs to be one, but I think it is increasingly being one, that people can see that if you cut public sector jobs, then private sector jobs will be lost too. That actually you fuck the economy if you do that. I think people are genuinely, personally outraged by the, you know, millions